All right, students. So with the scene that you currently worked on the last activity, let's go ahead and take a look at what we need to do. Now, so the first thing that I want you to do is we're going to be adding some of the shaders in here to make sure that we have the colors and the elements that we need for the water pipe. Now, like I said on the opening overview of this exercise, I'm going to show you very quickly where you're going to find the shaders that we need in order to do this. Now, if you created a shader that you like and you already have tweaked it and stuff, go ahead and use those shaders for the pipe. If you don't have those, if by some reason you didn't watch that part, don't worry. I went ahead and store them on the CGA. You go to Others and M Examples. Those are material examples, FMATs, and there you go. There's all the shaders in there. Even the one that you created, we also have it in there so you can get an idea on how we did it as well. So that way you could get it to explore your own work and make sure that everything is working properly for you. So what I'm going to do is all these instances are based off the same pipe water material. So if you open your material and you look at this one, you're going to notice that is a very similar material, the material that we've broken down with extra parts, or the parts are a little bit different. So now you could go ahead and kind of dissect what we did as well. If you didn't watch the video runs you through the whole process here, the bonus content, and then for the complex material, and you can take a look at that. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and assign, there's a couple of materials here that I did for different type of water pipes. You can select whatever you want. So this one right here, the instance for this one is the trickle. So I'm going to assign it to the trickle. You see it's like a little brownish tone, brownish color. And then from here, you could assign this pipe water instance to this one, for example, or if you want it, you could assign it to that one. It all depends on the type of color that you want. So essentially I gave you different variations so you could decide which ones you want to use in the final setup. So for this one, I'm going to use the complex, so it kind of distorts that as well. And for this one, we probably will use either that one, or we can use also the complex. Depends on the color that we want. I like the complex. It looks pretty good. Um, so yeah, so go ahead and drag those in. They're going to be, again, on the example area, FMATs, and that's where all your materials will be. So my recommendation is keep the one that you made for the water surface. If you don't want to keep that one, we provide you with one that you could use in your water surface. So now that we have those said and done, my recommendation is go in and kind of dissect a little bit more of the instance of those, and you could see how everything is organized and how I made those shaders for you guys to learn a little bit more about it. And keep those shaders with you as well, so you can use it in other projects. Now, the next thing is I want to use the particle system that I provided for you guys already. And we're going to utilize that particle system and combine it with this current element that we have here because we want to create that secondary waterfall. Not waterfall, but water coming out of here. Now, this Niagara effects, the reason why I have it here is because I did a complex Niagara effects with multiple emitters. And I wanted you guys to take a look at it and have some examples of how you take these multiple elements and how you tweak some of the settings in a different way. Here I'm using some settings that we never talked about, like dynamic material parameters. And now that you know that parameters are user created and we could use it to manipulate things outside of elements, this parameter is no different. This one actually connects with the material that we have assigned here for the specific particle. And we're going to be utilizing those type of techniques as we go through. So this will give you kind of an idea of what we're going to be doing. And you could dissect it on your own time. But I wanted to give you this effect already done. Also, I provided you with the steam. You have a big one and a small one. We already have placed those steams in there, so you have steams everywhere, already creating that atmospheric feel. I have one more water over here, back here. So let's go ahead into my materials. Let's assign this water instance. If you notice, I'm only assigning the instance ones, okay? Not the original water, pipe water. They all are based off these two. So all these variations right here, they're based on these two. All right, so going back to the particle system, let's go ahead and drag and drop that particle, Niagara particle in here. And I'm going to drag it into this section, and you notice that the pivot of this one is right at the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it close to the geometry, and you're going to see how we combine these two. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and give it 180 degrees. All right, and then we're going to move it inwards, so it's inside the pipe. Okay, and we're going to match it to what we currently have. There you go. All right, let's move it to the side. And what we need is we're going and using a combination of the two elements, and it provides us with a nice solid core and in all this beautiful detail. like the little edges and stuff like that. It looks better, much better, and it will provide us with shadows and things like that. So now that we have that, there you go. You can move it a little bit more if you need to, but the next thing I want to go for before we start with those is organization very quickly of the layers. So if you notice, we just created this particle right here, but yet we have this pipe water over here on the effects side. So what I want to do is I want to combine these two together. So I'm going to drag this particle right into this folder. So these two actually are that setup right there. And now we're going to have them together, so it's a little bit easier. Now, if you by some reason need to group these two, you could select them and you could hit Control G, and now you have a group that allows you to move both of them at the same time, so you can move that particle into another area. All right, so now that we know how to group elements together and how to organize it in a nice folder structure, let's go ahead and continue on with the rest of the stuff. So let's go ahead and create this one right here. So the first thing that we need to do in order to produce our water effect here, our pipe water with just Niagara, is to go ahead and first create a Niagara system. So let's right click, Effects, Niagara System. In here, we're going to just start with a basic emitter, and let's hit next. And we could start mostly with an empty emitter. We don't need that much, so let's start with an empty. Last time we started with some emitters already that will give us some information, but in this case, we're going to start with an empty. All right, and let's hit finish. So now that we have that empty emitter, we're going to give it the name pipe water. Okay, so ns underscore pipe water. And this is going to be only particles, so I'm going to say party. Just so I know it's a particle system. All right, so now that we have that, let's double click to open that guy up. And let me close the other one so we don't get confused. So we start with an empty system. And what we're going to start doing is we need to create like a couple of things first. We first need to spawn the emitter. So that's the first initial element that we will do. So let's go ahead and in the emitter update, let's go ahead and do a spawn. All right. Make sure it's not a spawn chaos. We just need a normal spawn rate. There we go. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go to the selection menu so we can actually see the properties of this. And in our spawn rate, what we're going to do is we're going to give it a spawn rate of about 100. Okay, now you're going to see it is right there, very little. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage right now and I'm going to assign the shader that we need for this specific emitter. And the shader that we're going to use is a shader that I already provided for you as well, that we prepared. So if you go to materials here, you see this little shader right here called pipe water foam PF instance. We're going to be utilizing that instance. Now, what I want you to do is we're going to go and select that shader. We're going to go to the top here and you're going to select the sprite render and we're going to drop that shader in. And there we go. Now we have this little element created for us already. All right, and that's what is going to give the body of our water. And right now we have 100 particles running through this. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to initialize those particles. Okay, and we're going to give it a little bit of a lifetime, a little bit of velocity in there. So let's go ahead and take a lifetime. And if you remember from the last class in around week 2, we went over how to add a little bit of differences here. So right now the lifetime is set to 1 range. We want a variation of ranges. So we want a range, for example, to go from a minimum to a maximum. So for that, we're going to be utilizing a uniform range. So let's go ahead and look for a range, uniform range float. And what that does is just separate minimum and maximum. I hope you remember this from that class. So, and then we're going to set this maximum to about a 2. So that way we have the lifetime kind of varying as we go. Let's give it a little bit of mass. And for the mass, we're going to be doing exactly the same thing. So we're going to be calling a range as well. And for the range, we're going to give it a little bit of weight to this. So 0.6, and let's give it around 1.2 to this one. Now, color, right now we're going to leave the color the way it is. We can give some yellows, depends on the type of water that you're creating. In reality, right now, white is perfectly fine because we're going to colorize it a little bit different later on. Now, let's take a look at the sprite size. Right now, we don't have any motion, so it's a little bit hard to see. So I'm going to come back into this one as soon as we add some motion into the particle. So what I want to do is I want to give a location to this. So let's go ahead and kind of add a sphere location to this to kind of expand the particle so you guys could see it a little bit better. So a location module allows you to kind of spawn the particles in a specific volume in this case. It could be a grid, it could be different ones. So if you hit the plus sign here and you look for just locations and you look down the list, right? And you look for locations, that's where the particle is going to be emitted. So look at all the variations that we have. So it depends on how you want to emit the particle. What is going to be the volume? In our scenario, is a pipe. So a sphere makes perfect sense. So let's go ahead and take the sphere, and the radius, we're going to keep it down to about a 7. Offset is going to be fine. Everything else is going to be fine. And a sphere random distribution, that's going to be fine. So now we have all those guys being emitted from a sphere. So you can see now it looks completely different than before. It was just a dot before, now it's a sphere. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add some motion. So for that motion to happen, we're going to add a little bit of linear motion. Remember, this is going to happen on the spawn. It's not an update. So we're going to add a linear force, and we're going to say fix because we need to add a solve force and velocity to that. And now you notice that another node got added down here to be able to calculate that force. Now, what we're going to do with the force is give that linear push to make it look like the water is pushing out of the pipe. So for that, we're going to be using our X direction, just to keep one of the directions. X is going to be left and right. So it makes it a little bit more sense. So when we rotate, the water is not pushing up or it's pushing down. So in this case, we're just going to utilize X to make it easier on us when we're developing or moving things around. So let's give it about 300. And you're going to notice it's going to go crazy, crazy, crazy. It's like a whole line. It's just pushing those particles super fast. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine up to the moment. The next thing that we're going to do is we need to add a little bit of drag to this so we could get those particles to fall down and some little gravity as well. And we're going to come back to this in a second. So let's go to the particle update and add a little bit of gravity. We want those particles to go ahead and kind of come down. So let's click on fix the issue. You already know why that happens. And now we have something that looks a little bit more along those lines. Now the other thing that I want to make sure that I do is I need to add some drag to this. So let's go ahead and add some drag. All right. And let's fix that issue. We need to move it above. And for the drag, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it like a high value because there's a lot of speed here. So I just want it to come out and then start coming down. All right, so that's pretty good. That's looking pretty nice. We will work with the scale in a second, but at least we're getting the motion first, and that's the key here. We want to get that motion. All right, so the next thing is let's keep working with the spawning velocity. I want this to fan out a little bit. Right now is too straight, so I'm going to give it a little bit of an angle. So I'm going to go to particle spawn, and I'm going to use an add velocity in cone. So let's add velocity. And we're going to use in cone. So we're able to control how much it opens versus how much it closes. All right, so we're going to do a minimum and a maximum of, let's go ahead and say velocity strength. Let's give it a minimum and max. So let's go ahead and do a range here. All right, we might not need the range if we want exactly the same power. So let's see, let's go 500 in minimum and let's do 500, but minimum actually, let's give it like about 300. Let's see what happens there. All right, it's pushing out a little bit further. Some of them are falling a little bit earlier than the others, but that's pretty good. Now the cone angle, let's give it like around a 2. We want that cone angle to still spill out, but we want just a little bit. I think we're gonna go and kind of keep them a little bit more streamlined. So it might be that we might come back and just set this to uniform range to the same exact. So we might take this off and just set this to 500. That way it gives me more like a stream. Okay, I like that. All right, so now that we have that, the next thing that we're going to do is our cone axis is set up fine. Let's take the velocity distribution 0.75 in here to kind of give it a little bit more variation. All right, and now that we have that, let's take and apply those initial forces. Let's move this down below the add velocity, and that will take care of everything else. And that's pretty good. All right, let me zoom out a little bit, and that's looking nice. So now we have the motion. It's coming out the pipe. It seems like there is a pipe in there, and it's coming down. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I need to look at the force. The gravity force by default is set up the way it's supposed to, so it's 980. The drag, the same idea, we already set it up. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to start controlling the color, the scale, and things like that. So in order to control the scale, let's call to initialize particle. And in that section right there, what we're going to do is we're going to control the scale based on a vector 2D float. So right now there's two values right here. We want to have a main value to it. So let's go ahead and say float vector 2D from float, and that's perfectly fine. And that will give us one single value that will control the particle. Let's take this value around 67, and now we get a nice kind of big chunk of water coming out. So it looks a little bit more violent. All right. So the next thing that we need is a little bit of rotation on the sprite. So we're going to turn this on to give a little bit more randomness in there. And in that rotation, what we want to do is we want to normalize it by the angle. So that's the first thing. So let's go ahead and click this and add a normalize angles to degrees. So if we go in and say normalize angles to degrees, that will allow us to control from 0 to 360, and then we're going to give a range. So right here in the normalize angle, instead of just controlling it this way, you see how it's moving it around? It's just one value, so we don't want that. So what we want is we want two values, so let's go ahead and add a range. All right, so now that we have that range, let's take the second value here and let's keep it at 1.5. Let's give it like 1.5. I don't want it to move so fast, but I want to start at around -10. So it starts in one area and then starts varying to the next one. And here we probably could go a little bit higher, 1.75, and that would be pretty nice. All right, so far so good. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a color to this so we can colorize it. Even though we already have a color, we're going to move this initialize particles and we're going to go to the color part. And then what we're going to do here on the color is we're going to add a little bit of green to this. So let's go ahead and take this and start lowering this green. I'm going to lower the saturation a little bit and let's go to the yellows. I want this kind of type of green. There we go. So when you think about that, always think about, okay, this is going to be the base water. So I want the base water to be slightly darker. And then as we add different layers, we're going to make those slightly brighter. So that's looking pretty good so far. So one more thing that we're going to do is we need this to fade based on the speed. So we need this to be dark at the beginning and then dark at the end. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to also fall off. So I'm going to add a scale color first. So let's find scale color. And we also going to add a scale by speed. So add that, scale by speed. All right. So I'm going to move the scale by speed higher, and I try to keep them all together before the solve force and velocity. It really doesn't matter because it's color. But if you notice, the scale color by speed adds like a darkness to the top and on the bottom, and it's controlled by a curve. And then the scale color, we're going to turn that on in a second, and that's going to be for fading the texture or fading the particle. So let's take the scale by speed, and you notice there is a range in here. And what we can do with that range is control that range based on a curve. So when the particle starts as dark, then it's light, then it's back to dark. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the minimum value and the maximum value, and I'm going to control it with a curve. So these two values right here. So if I take this guy and I crank it up, you notice that we could get some brightness in there, but I want that brightness to fall off. The same happens with the minimum value. So we're going to start first with the max and see if we need the minimum. So I'm going to click on this side to add the attribute there or manipulate the attribute, the parameter. And let's go ahead and add a curve. And the curve will be a curve from float. There you go. And what we're going to do is very similar to what we did on earlier classes. You notice that this goes dark, light, dark. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to move this guy right here. And we're going to give a value of 0 to that. All right, so it's down. So you notice everything now is dark, so we can't see anything. So actually, let's give it around 0.5 so we see something. We don't want it to be black. We just want it when it's coming out of the tube to be a little bit darker. All right, now in the middle right here, around 0.15 or something like that, let's go ahead and take this guy and give it a different value. Let's give it around 0.6 or something like that. 0.6. We could go a little bit higher than that as well. Let's pull this back 0.18, and that's pretty good. All right. And then let's check this guy here. It's a little bit too bright still, so let's do 0.42. That's a little bit better. It's come from darkness there. All right, so now that we have that, let's snap this into the side and top to bottom. So click on these two to kind of snap the whole curve. And we want this curve at the top to actually be auto, so it kind of falls off very nicely. All right, and that's pretty good. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is let's take the minimum and do the same thing because we want to control that a little bit more. So let's click here. Let's set this to a curve from float or float from curve. And let's do something similar. But in this case, we want it to start at 0 because the original value was 0. So let's take this value at 0 time and set it up to 0. Then the next value that we're going to do is we're going to start with a little higher value, and then we come down again to a minimum value. So the second one, what we're going to do is we're going to do a value of around, let's just click on here first, and let's take this and based on the time, remember this is the time of the particle, the lifetime of the particle. So let's go ahead and set this to when it's in 0.2 or 0.25, it's fine if you set it up. Let's give it a very high value, and that's going to make it really bright at the top. It's going to fake lighting, okay? Even though they're going to interact a little bit with lighting, it's going to fake that lighting. And now you see it looks really, really cool. It starts giving some dimension to the particle system. All right. So the next one, I'm going to snap it here, making sure that it's snapped to left and right. And let's take this, right click, and let's set it to auto. Now, the end point and the beginning point, I want these two also to fall off nicely. So let's right click, auto. All right, and the endpoint right here, what I want to do is I want to give it some value to it. I don't want to be super dark because it's hitting that water, so it's getting to that location. So I want to give it a little bit of value. So let's go ahead and give it like around a 4.5, something that is brighter, so it's not super dark. All right, so we're done with that. Perfect. So now that we have those two, great. Let's go to the scale color. And what we're going to use this one for is just to fall off the kind of a fade off of the texture. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to modify the alpha. And we're going to use the same thing. We're going to use a curve to modify the alpha. That means that's going to control transparency during the lifetime of the particle. So we want the particle to start pretty much bright, okay, or pretty much solid, opaque, and then little by little starts falling off to 0. All right, but we're going to have one of these values right in the middle, right around 0.5, around that range. That is going to be slightly higher, and then I'm going to just go ahead and do this, and I'm going to move this tangent like this. So it's going to come in lower. It's going to have a little bit of information in there. It's going to go higher. Now let me give it around 0.8. And that's pretty good. So this area right here is going to still kind of retain the solid aspect of it. Now, this scale curve right here, if you need to compress it, you will see that it's falling off a little bit quicker. So the more you compress it, the faster it falls off. And you notice that now we don't have that volume. So this scale curve could be used in order to compress the time here, the lifetime of the particle, so you can compress the curve. So let's put it back to 1. All right, so we're done with our first element. It's a good idea now to go ahead and save, file, save all. And what I'm going to do is, for the purpose of testing everything out, I'm going to drag this system right into the level as I continue my tweaks. So right now is backwards, and go ahead and rotate it 180 degrees. And the arrow will actually point the way that we have our fluid going. So essentially in this case, of course, is just X, the opposite of X. And now you can see that we gave it some dimension. And right there, it looks good with just one of those elements. Now, we could add more layers to make it even cooler. Just go ahead and place it. And that's pretty good, but it still doesn't look like water. It needs a little bit more, okay? And that's where we're going to go next.